Now, in the early days, there was no such thing as a programming language. Programming languages were invented. But before programming languages, when computers were the size of football fields, what we had was valves, and they switched those valves on and off, and these valves were fairly large. So that's why your computers were so large, and now you can store a bit on a tiny piece of metal with a magnetic charge, and that's why your computers can get smaller. But back then they had big valves and they could turn them on and off, and then that would produce an output. And these programmers had to work with ones and zeros. They had to work with those valves. They have to say on or off. That was it. They had no other choice. They didn't have a programming language that they could write. So what happened was, as computers evolved, and they wouldn't be as popular today if we didn't have programming languages. The problem with writing in ones and noughts and so forth is the fact that you would be facing a sea of ones and noughts, and it would be impossible to make an operating system, or even, let's say, a graphics editor or a video editor. So we created a language, and now we have many languages that we can use to communicate with a computer, whether it be C, Java, JavaScript, and so forth. You have all of these different programming languages, and due to all these different programming languages, we now have all sorts of languages to communicate with the computer. But going back, there used to be programmers that programmed in ones and zeros. And this is what firmware is. Firmware is a physical program. It exists within the silicon as positive and negative charges. Somebody has actually had to physically program so that your computer could boot up. When you press the on button on your computer, well, your computer doesn't understand programming languages. Programming languages were invented for us, not for the computer. So when you boot your computer up, it's not working with programming languages. In fact, your computer doesn't understand programming languages. We do, the human beings. But when you first boot it up, you'll find firmware boots your computer up. Physical programs that exist as ones and noughts that boot your computer up. And then once your computer has booted up, then your software can kick in, and then let's say your operating system can start to rock and roll. Now you have different types of firmware, what we class as different types. Well, you have different types of programs on your computer. You may have a program for your email, another program for video editing, another program for so on and so forth. Well, firmware does have different types. The main one is BIOS, and there are quite a few BIOSes in your computer. Many people may be going, well, wait, I know about a main BIOS. And that's the one most people know, but there is more than one BIOS. Why? Because the criteria for firmware to be a BIOS is a basic input-output system. So whatever firmware it is, if it receives input and it provides an output, then it is a BIOS. It is a basic input and output system. That's all the criteria it needs to match in order for it to be classed as a BIOS. But there is a main BIOS chip. Now the main BIOS chip is the one that starts up when your computer first boots up. It is the firmware, the program that loads before your operating system. Your operating system wouldn't boot up without the main BIOS. But these are programs that boot up before your operating system, and they load up subroutines and so forth, and they put them into memory, and that way your computer can use that to perform its processes, and your operating system can use that. But without the BIOS, the board wouldn't boot. So BIOS is an acronym for Basic Input Output System. Firmware is physical programs that exist as positive and negative charges. And you have more than one BIOSes all over your computer. Your BIOSes are basic input and output systems. They receive input and they provide output. That's all you need in order to have firmware that is classed as a BIOS. And you have a main BIOS, which is the one that most people have heard of, And that basic input-output system, that main BIOS, is the bit that actually allows your computer to boot up. It gives it the initial information it needs, and it can't get that from a programming language. Somebody has to physically program that in ones and noughts, because that's all your computer understands, ones and noughts, or positive and negative charges.